Well, I miss not seeing Cat Morehouse out there. Seems very strange. We have Gloria Gonzalez, I guess, sitting in for Cat, although not sitting in because Cat's gone on to different things. But anyway, miss seeing her. Let me follow up on some remarks I made at the very beginning, and that is about the events of this week. The heat challenges that all our system operators met, but they were all tight, and that's lingo for they were at the edge of their resource adequacy, which really drives home a couple things, and I want to emphasize it again. I'm going to give you some numbers from PJM specifically. It just drives home. This whole thing drives home the importance of resource adequacy, and we had our technical conference earlier this month. Spent 2 whole days looking at all the RTOs, and they all face similar challenges. Some more so than others, in terms of we're facing unheard of load forecasts. I say unheard of in the last 50 years, largely driven by data center development, especially AI-enabled data centers. And we're simply not building generation fast enough, and we're not keeping generation that we need to keep. And I mean, this week, some of our systems really came close to the edge. They were in emergency circumstances. They were running generators that needed to be on maintenance, and they wouldn't let them go on maintenance. They kept them running. They managed through it. And again, I give them all the credit. These are both RTOs and non-RTOs. The whole eastern U.S. Was faced with this. So it really just drives home that our resource adequacy conference was both timely and relevant. That is the central issue facing this country going forward is resource adequacy. Consumer cost is another issue, but you first have to have the resources. I mean, no one wants to. If we'd had rolling outages, load shedding in these temperatures, I mean, it would have been life-threatening. In addition to being more than uncomfortable, it could have been life-threatening. So that's how important resource adequacy is. And let me give you some specific numbers that I just got from PJM. And I pick out PJM because, first of all, we live in PJM, and that's the I'm on their dashboard all the time in events like this. So in January, PJM hit a winter peak, an all-time winter peak on January 20th. They hit an all-time winter peak of 145 gigawatts of load. And they met that winter peak with the following generation mix. Gas, 44%. Nuclear.
Unknown caller.
Who's that? Okay. Gas, 44%. Nuclear, 22%. Coal, 22%. Solar was 0. Wind was 2.4. So in the January winter peak for PJM at 145 gigs, 88% was what we call dispatchable resources. So what happened this week? I got these numbers from PJM. PJM peaked in this heat event Monday. They peaked at 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock p.m. Monday. They peaked at 161 gigs of load, which is 16 gigs more than their winter peak. There's been some thought PJM is moving to be a winter peaking system, but this year, the summer peak this week was 161 gigs, even higher than the winter peak. What was their generation mix at 6 p.m. Monday evening when they hit that peak? Gas was 44%, which was exactly the number it was in the winter. Nuclear was 20%, which was a little bit, a shade lower than it was. Coal was 19%, still a major contributor. Solar was 5%, so that was better than 0, which it was in the winter, but it was still only 5%, even, and the sun was shining. So it was 5%. Wind was 3%. So at 6 p.m. on Monday, what was keeping the air conditioners running and keeping everybody from having extremely uncomfortable circumstances, even life-threatening, once again, the dispatchable was 83%. So 88% dispatchable hitting winter peak, 83% hitting summer peak last Monday, 6 o'clock. So it gets back to the whole issue of resource adequacy. And PJM was running every unit they had. I mean, they had the number I got from PJM as far as what were their reserves at peak was about 10 gigs. That was it. So they had 161 gigs of load, and they had about 10 gigs of reserves. at that point. So they weren't literally, at zero, but that's pretty tight. That's very tight. Also, I will say this: PJM said that demand response was essential. DR. It was essential in DR doesn't serve load. DR reduces load. So that 161 gig peak would have actually been higher without DR, because that's what DR does. DR lowers peak. And that's what DR is supposed to do. DR is sometimes used to be called peak shaving. And PJM said DR was essential. Because, again, they had about 10 gigs of reserves, so the DR helped tremendously. That 161 gig peak would have been higher without DR. So DR is an important part of the mix too, and same in MISO. So I mentioned that to show this is the challenge. This is the resource adequacy challenge, and I compliment all the system operators, RTO and non-RTO. Everybody was tight, very tight, but everybody got through it. But you never know about the next time, and there's going to be a next time, and we've got to have more resources. That's bottom line. We have got to have more resources, because no one thinks load isn't going to keep going up. No one thinks that we're not going to keep having more data centers, and and that's the challenge. That's the challenge we face. So with that, that's my opening remarks, and I go to Q&A. Yes, Carrie.
Thanks so much for doing this, Chairman. Callie Pattison with the Washington Examiner.
Callie, that's right.
Yeah. It happens all the time. Don't worry.
That's right.
Going off of that, earlier this month, Texas Governor Greg Abbott signed a law that gives the local grid operator the power to disconnect data centers in firm load shed events. Is that something that we could see enforced nationally? Would love to know your reaction to that law.
Well, as you know, Texas is not regulated by FERC, and Texas is its own grid under its own laws. But I think one thing that illustrates interconnection of a load customer, like a data center, to a grid is under state law. Under state law, not federal. So Texas was perfectly within their jurisdiction to, if that's the way they want to handle it. I'm not going to opine on the merits of the law. I've got a feeling that law was probably opposed by Google, Amazon, some other names you'd recognize, because the data centers want to run 24/7, 365. They don't, But it's one way to meet the challenge, and that's what Texas chose to do. Their legislature passed it, so I'm not going to opine on it. But other than to say that when a load customer interconnects to the grid, that is a retail customer interconnecting to the grid, and that is under state jurisdiction. Yeah, Carlos.
Hi, Carlos with E&E News. I have two. One is that the Southeast Supply Enhancement Project and the MVP Southgate are running alongside each other. I think they're only 50 feet apart. So are both of those needed, given that they would be going across the same route, given what you've talked about with data centers? And then my second question, just given today that Mark had talked about a number of times that what happened in Spain was not any resource's fault, I was just curious to get your reaction to what Secretary Wright said in April when he said, when you hitch your wagon to the weather, it's just a risky endeavor. So was the Secretary wrong there?
Well, you're on two totally different topics. The first one I can answer real quickly. The Southeast Enhancement Project, which is one application, and then the Mountain Valley Southgate, which is another application, are both pending. They're both here. The question of need under the Natural Gas Act is always a central question of any NGA application, so I can't talk about either one of them. So the other one was about the presentation from Spain. Look, I told you what was the generation mix in PJM hitting the peak on Monday night at 6 o'clock was 83% dispatchable. It was 88% in January. I think that in the mix of generation as a state regulator, where state rate. This is another point I want to make. I said you mentioned that Callie mentioned the Texas law. The generation mix is under state control. This is an important point. FERC doesn't pick a generation mix. FERC doesn't license or permit a single generating unit. We don't. The generation mix is for states to decide. That's a state issue, and obviously we know. And at the tech conference here earlier this month, I made the point about PJM. The challenge that PJM faces in being a grid operator and trying to manage that grid in PJM is you have 13 states in PJM plus DC. And when I started as a state regulator in PJM, everybody basically wanted the same thing. Everybody just wanted reliable power at the least cost. That's what people wanted. Now you've got states in PJM that have 100% renewable, 80% renewable, mandatory renewable. You've got other states, like obviously West Virginia, Ohio, that want to build, they want to keep coal running. They want to build more gas. So you got these 13 states in PJM who have now very divergent policies on what kind of generation they want. And PJM has to try to literally balance all these competing state policies. And I said at the tech conference, and I'll say it again, I'll continue to say it, I think that the challenge in PJM and the problem in PJM is not the economics of the capacity market. I mean, I think theoretically, out of a textbook, it makes sense. But the textbook is not reality, and the reality is the politics. And the politics in PJM, it's a political challenge in PJM. It's not an economic challenge. The economic theory is fine. I'm not going to argue with any economist. They can't understand me, and I can't understand them. So once we get beyond supply and demand. The problem in PJM is the politics of different states wanting different generation mixes, and same in MISO, by the way, same in MISO. So different generating resources have different characteristics. We all know that. PJM has attempted to address the different characteristics through what they call ELCC, which is accreditation, and I think PJM has made a lot of progress on that. But at the end of the day, in America, states decide what generation that they want to build and what generation they want to retire. And we're a 50-state union, and the states, I did this for 17 years as a state regulator, approved several generating units in Virginia. We approved solar, we approved wind, we approved 4 combined cycle gas, which are critically important. We approved uprates for nuke. But states do that. FERC doesn't do that. Yeah. Daniel.
Thanks for taking my question.
Yeah.
The Energy Department in a couple weeks is expected to release a new methodology for grid reserve margins across the United States. And I'm just curious, because FERC and NERC already oversee grid reserve margins. First of all, has FERC had any involvement in helping DOE craft that? And secondly, how do you think that fits into what FERC and NERC already do, and what do you think the result of that will be?
Well, I haven't seen it, so I don't know what's going to be in it. But let me make this point. This gets back to my point about accreditation. Remember the opening question I asked at the tech conference? I asked all the RTO CEOs. This was the first panel. You go back and watch it again. You can watch it on YouTube. It's all there. First question I asked to that first panel of the CEOs from the RTOs, I said, is it time for FERC to mandate or potentially DOE or whoever, is it time to have a mandatory reserve requirement across all RTOs? And you can go back and listen to their answers. So I think that's the question. In the non-RTOs, it's under state regulation. In the non-RTOs, because the non-RTOs, it's all driven by a state-regulated IRP. So it's the question I asked, of course, our tech conference was limited to RTOs, and the question was, should we have a mandatory and require every load-serving entity in the RTO to meet that mandatory reserve margin? I personally think we're going to have to move towards something like that because, again, look at this week. Look how tight all these grid operators were, from not having again, coming right up to the edge of not having enough resources. Now, one way and again, this also gets back to the accreditation issue, and PJM has made a lot of progress on the ELCC and valuing generating units based on their real reliability attributes in terms of the capacity market payments they get. Remember, PJM uses a capacity market, at least for, and I've been very critical of the capacity market for 21 years. But again, the challenge in the capacity market is not the economic theory. Again, it's the political reality of how with all these different states. Okay. Yeah, Maya.
Thank you. Maya Weber with Platts. You mentioned that you're going to be staying for the next FERC meeting. I wanted to ask if you had any priorities as far as things you'd like to get done before you go or launch before you go, and also whether you're considering at all staying until the next commissioner is seated.
Well, no announcement beyond the July open meeting. And as I said, I mean, if the Senate confirms my successor, I won't be here for that. But if they don't, then I'll be here for the July open meeting and have no announcement beyond that. As far as what I want to get done, I want to get a lot of stuff done. We've got a lot of important cases, and July's historically a busy month at FERC because there's no meeting in August. But I'm not going to name a case or something that I want to get out the door, because that would, you're not supposed to name cases or when you want to do them. So there's plenty of work to do, and I want to keep helping to do it. Yeah, Tom.
Thank you, Tom Tiernan with the Energy Daily. Follow up on the NERC report. The Commission issued a proposed rule dealing with inverter-based resources in December, and comments have come in on that. I know it's a pending rule, so I'm not asking, but
right.
in terms of inverter-based resources and that process, how confident are you that any final rule that comes from that proceeding will be able to address the ride-through capabilities and some of the lessons learned that Mark talked about?
Well, that's why I brought it up with him, and I said, I gave him a chance to talk more about the ride-through, the proposal from NERC. I think it's absolutely needed, personally, and I support it. NERC has done what NERC is supposed to do. NERC is supposed to give us dispassionate, objective, engineering-based recommendations, and I see no reason to think that's not. Okay, I mean, it's very controversial because people whose ox is gored obviously don't like it, because that's the way it works. But I have no reason to think that what NERC has proposed is not the proper engineering solution, and that's what we ought to be supporting.
Thank you.
Right. Yeah, Gloria.
Hi, Gloria Gonzalez with Politico. I just wanted to follow up about 871. I'm curious about your thoughts about what types of projects are going to be most impacted during the waiver period, and what landowners or other organizations who may have objections to particular projects should be thinking about and doing in the meantime as FERC considers possibly permanently rescinding the order.
Yeah, the reason we went ahead and suspended or waived 871 is it had become basically a tool to get an automatic stay on a project during rehearing process, and so it had become a barrier to proceeding with construction. It doesn't end the rehearing process. It doesn't end the ability of someone who wants to oppose a project to oppose it. But the point is, it had become misused, and in that misuse, it was supposed to have been for an individual property owner facing eminent domain to get, to put off the execution of eminent domain for that time period. But what it turned into was every group that wanted to oppose a pipeline automatically, and we know who they are, just used it to get an automatic stay and hold up the construction. And so that's why we suspended it. But the waiver is not the final rule. The final rule obviously will come after comment and after, I'm sure there'll be a lot. And so ultimately the details will be in the final rule. This was just an interim waiver. And by the way, if you read the fine print, actually I think it's 12-point type like everything else, but there's a provision that an individual property owner can still seek to get that stay if they're facing eminent domain. So it doesn't, that possibility is still there, but it's a case-by-case determination. It's not an automatic stay, which is what it had been abused.
Let's go to a question online. Keith Goldberg with Law 360.
Hi, Chairman. Thanks for doing this. Hello. Had a question regarding the end of your term. Had you hoped to have been nominated to serve another term, and had you, prior to being informed of the nominee to replace you, had you had any sort of suspicion that you were not going to be nominated for another term?
Says Keith, who was the first one to direct message me. George Wycamp called me. Keith DM'd, so I don't know who went first. But I didn't know before. I mean, that's what I said. I said in the social media.
Okay, but had you hoped to have, would you have liked to serve another term?
Well, I'm not even going to address that at this point because it's just hypothetical.
I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. How is it hypothetical?
Well, when I was asking about before, I said I'm not going to address that possibility. I'm just going to leave that as a subject of whatever confidential communications might take place. So I didn't address it before, so I don't want to address it now.
Okay. Have you had any communication with the White House at all?
I've had communication with a member of the National Energy Dominance Council. We've had a nice conversation about what we're doing. I've had regular conversations with him about what we do. Mainly it's about what we do at FERC. And keeping him in touch, keeping him updated. So happy to do that. Continue to do that. Not about the appointment at all.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think we have another question online. Pete Bear with E&E News.
Hello, Chairman. Thanks for doing this.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you, does the U.S. grid have adequate ride-through and voltage support today? And if not, does that increase the risk of a situation like the Spanish outage? In other words, are there kind of underlying conditions that aren't where you'd like to see them in those areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that threat is there. I think that the lesson from the report we got today and what happened in Spain is that we need to be cognizant of and on top of addressing the challenges that come with a heavy penetration of IBR resources, inverter-based resources. They do present different challenges. They absolutely do. That's an engineering judgment, not a political judgment. And I thought that NERC, described those pretty much detail today. It was very engineering heavy, but that's why we have NERC. And they have proposed those IBR ride-through standards, which are pending, and I'm strongly supportive of them. I think we have to do them and address the challenges that we see with that different type of resource. Absolutely.
But do you think that that need is a reason not to consider IBR resources?
That need?
In other words, is that a reason to prefer synchronous generation over the inverter-based resources?
Dispatchable resources have a lot different characteristics than IBRs. We know the weather. IBRs are weather dependent. Okay, solar, the sun has to shine. Wind, the wind has to blow. Those are unalterable facts. Okay, those aren't opinions. Those are unalterable facts. They have different characteristics because they're weather dependent. Other resources are weather affected. Okay, but there's a fundamental difference between weather dependent and weather affected. even a coal plant in a freeze like we had in Winter Storm Uri in Texas, a coal pile can freeze. Okay, we've had weather events where the nukes went down. TVA lost a nuke. TVA lost one of its nukes in this heat event. So dispatchable resources are not, immune to weather. Okay, they are weather affected, but weather affected is fundamentally different than being weather dependent. And so when you put together a generation resource mix, wind and solar can be a very good energy resource. By energy resource, I'm talking about a real-time energy resource in terms of feeding power into the grid. When they're cooking, literally. But you also have to have capacity, and they're not good capacity resources. Capacity is the ability to deliver when called upon, and they're not. Because you cannot be weather dependent and be a dispatchable resource. And so good energy resource, obviously LMP for wind and solar is zero because they have no fuel costs. So LMP, which is the price in the energy markets, locational marginal pricing. And because these energy markets dispatch on marginal cost, that's the pricing mechanism we've been using 20 some years, they're always going to win, because they're going to dispatch at zero. Actually, with the subsidies, they dispatch below zero. So they're guaranteed to win in our real-time energy markets. So they can be a good energy resource. Solar in particular, I think, has played a big role in Texas. But they play a big role when sun's shining. Now, battery capability can extend, obviously, the value. And California's done a lot with this. They had to deal with the duck curve about what happens when the sun goes down over the Pacific at, between 5 and 9 p.m. California, and the reason it looks like a duck curve, if you see it charted, they have tremendous solar generation in the afternoon, and then all of a sudden it's like wham, it just drops off when that sun goes down over the Pacific. So they've tried to deal with that with a lot of battery technology, and you can do that up to a point. But where we are with batteries right now is our batteries are basically 2 to 4 hour batteries. You can't keep the lights on in San Francisco on 2 to 4 hours, and the typical commercial battery maybe a couple hundred megawatts. So the batteries are not the silver bullet. Battery technology needs to continue to develop. So the lesson of the whole thing is you've got to have dispatchable resources. That's why I got those numbers from PJM about what was keeping the air conditioners running Monday at 6 o'clock and what was keeping the heat pumps keeping us from freezing to death back in January 20th. You've got to have dispatchable resources. There's no way around that.
Okay, are there any other questions in the room?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Carlos.
Hi. I wanted to ask if you thought that Commissioner C should or should not participate in MVP Southgate, just given her past role as solicitor in West Virginia.
That's one I didn't expect. Commissioner C is fully capable of determining when she should participate or not.
Okay, with that, I think we're done.
Okay.
Thank you
All
all
right.
so much.
Thanks, guys.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Chairman.